Hi, class. Need that coffee. Welcome to week 6. Outside my window is quite a rainy day, so quite different from the heat that you experience in your window, which I hope that you enjoyed watching. A great filmic example of how we are surrounded by and enact the gaze in our everyday lives. For this week's class, in our video, we'll look at gender, power, the gaze, and surveillance, and how these concepts tie into today's context, which we'll discuss in class. Indeed, Rear Window is the perfect film for it. Rear Window from 1954 tells the story of L.B. Jeffries, a man stuck in his apartment in a wheelchair while recovering from a badly broken leg. To amuse himself, Jeffries starts spying on his neighbors. The recreational snooping suddenly takes a dark turn when he witnesses what may or may not be a murder. For the viewer, the pleasure of watching Jeff slowly unravel the mystery depends on being restricted to his incomplete understanding of the events unfolding outside his rear window. This is done through mise-en-scène that we went through last week. And to heighten this reflection on how we look and who is looked at, Hitchcock chooses restricted narration. So what does this mean? It limits the information that it provides the audience to things known only to a single character. This approach encourages the audience to identify with a character's singular perspective on perplexing and frightening events, and invites us to participate in the gradual unlocking of a narrative's secrets. And we'll see how this identification with a character, or through a character rather, connects with the notion of the gaze. So again, whether it's a pregnant teenager trying to find suitable parents to adopt her baby, as we saw in Juno, virtually every film narrative paradigms depends upon two essential elements: a character pursuing a goal. And we'll explore how this is, including within the narrative paradigms that you see on the slide, on every film we watch going forward, to consider Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3, and how the story unfolds with the character trying to pursue their goal. The kind of backbone of every film, especially every narrative film. So to begin our lecture, we're first thinking of representation. So the media represents information to its audience, who are encouraged by usually the mainstream media to see their output as a window on the world, as a kind of reflection of reality. Yet the process of representing information is highly complex and highly selective. Many feminists argue that the way notions of gender are represented by the media perpetuate and reinforce the values of a patriarchal society. For instance, men tend to take on strong, active roles, while women are shown as passive and relying on their attractiveness. The same goes for people of color, Black people, disabled people. The cinema shows them in very narrow ways, and we'll see how that's enacted in the following films that we'll see: Boys in the Hood, we'll look at Girlhood and Do the Right Thing, and actually a few films going forward. And since representation shifts on modes of dominant forces, it can change. So therefore, what we see and how we see changes and shifts, which is really an important element for me to consider for what I want as a teachable during this class, is that what we see and how we see it can actually change, even though it's seemingly the same thing in front of us, the same movie, the same characters. Now, how gender is portrayed in film to some extent reflects concerns and anxieties in our society about who we are, which are reenacted through the narrative. The acting of male and female roles is a performance, a simulation which is not fixed but constantly shifting. So, which I'll get to. Film is a representation of images, and it is not reality, but a series of shots with actors playing characters. These images are concentrated, symbolic, and highly charged. They have superpowered meaning. In mainstream film, we are clearly intended to identify with and recognize certain characters and gender types. If film is to have a resonance with for an audience, it must contain elements with which they can identify or empathize, and at some level, must say something about the world in which we live. So it's both interesting and revealing to look at how a film's characters are made recognizable and how we understand them, and what our culture portrays as being representative of masculinity and femininity, and what that tells us about our understanding of gender, sexuality, and society. Cultural theorist Stuart Hall argues that, again, meaning is constantly changing and it's not fixed. So what we see and how we see it changes over time. And so to know that what we see is not fixed, it's imperative to critically engage and interrogate the meanings of the media messages that surround us, the media representations. So this calls attention to the fact that culture is produced within relationships of domination and subordination and tends to reproduce or resist existing structures of power, and yet can also do that at the same time, something we've discussed a little already. And when we're thinking about relationship of domination and subordination, what we're really starting to consider is ideology. Can be seen as a dominant set of ideas and values which inform any society or culture and which are imbued in its social behavior and imbued in representative texts, such as films, at a level that is not necessarily obvious or conscious. And that's what's really key about it. Ideology is a kind of dominant social order, and we'll discuss what that can be in class. Part of ideology is that it allows meanings to be embedded in an image that appear as natural. So I get you thinking about ideology and what are some ideologies, or in other words, social norms that are being constructed and projected here in this image from your window. Take a second to consider it. Now, let's consider the gaze in the context of representation and ideology. Feminists generally believe that the media and its male gaze is a contributing factor to perpetuating a narrow range of stereotype images for women. As I mentioned before, it can stem from patriarchy. How women are represented in the media may encourage particular expectations of women which are extremely limiting. So to go back to Lisa and how she is seen. Last week, we analyzed the mise-en-scène in the scene with Lisa, but what about bringing in gender and the gaze into it? Jeffrey's stationary, does the looking, and we do it with him. When we see Lisa, we look at her. She doesn't look at us. Look at the soft lighting, the camera angle. She has us falling in love with her. Right? Women are the objects of romance and men have varied roles. And this happens in film all the time. And so feminist analysis says there are other ways. There are other ways of women to be and not just to be looked at. And of course, while this seems at first glance very obvious, Rear Window in true Hitchcock style actually plays with the sort of gendered role in this movie and kind of flips the script at the end. Do you remember what that is? It wasn't until the late 1970s that the term the gaze, which I'm referring to here, became known as a full-fledged idea. The key text that will always come up if you do anything related to cinema is called Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, a 1975 essay by filmmaker and theorist Laura Mulvey. She has since then revised it, and it has been expanded on to account for non-white perspectives and non-cisgendered perspectives. But that doesn't take away from its central role in presenting the relationship between looking, gender, and power in visual culture, and specifically in films. Film theory has always been at the heart of the discussions of the gaze because film viewing is very much predicated on representations mediated by modes of looking. And looking is always a political act and is always influenced by ideologies. Film theory also makes use of psychoanalysis in its exploration of the bodily pleasure in looking at other people's lives and projecting fantasies onto them. Psychoanalysis is actually quite interesting if you get into the deeper stuff that isn't solely focused on Freud's cocaine-fueled research, actually. So in her work, Mulvey refers to the filmic gaze, which is her term for two voyeuristic male looks. And I take this from Terry Senf, that she notes two ways that male spectators can identify with a film, especially with classic Hollywood cinema. One, the male spectator can identify with the position of the camera, which frames and controls the female body image. Two, the male spectator can identify with the active male protagonist, for whom female characters appear as objects of desire. So watch any mainstream films, especially ones that are a decade or so older, or now even, and this comes up again and again and again. That's partly why the Bechdel test was created, but more on that another time. And by the way, women can also internalize the male gaze. Further, women of color are not only marginalized as women, but as marginalized as people of color. And so Bell Hooks, in response to Laura Mulvey, wrote about the oppositional gaze, which means that women of color are able to cast a critical eye on white womanhood as an object of male gaze. It's quite different for them, something we can explore in class. In conjunction to her definition of the male gaze, Laura Mulvey also brings forth other key psychoanalytic terms to the study of cinema: scopophilia, the pleasure in looking; exhibitionism, the pleasure in being looked at; and voyeurism, the pleasure in looking without being seen. Scopophilic pleasure is available in the cinema, since viewers watch in an enclosed world where images appear apparently regardless of who's watching. Thus, the spectators seem to be looking in on a private world and can project their desires onto the actors. In this scene, Lisa confronts Jeffries about his intense looking, and here we see various levels of voyeurism at play.
Sheriff, if you could only see yourself.
What's the matter?
Sitting around looking out of the window to kill time is one thing, but doing it the way you are with binoculars and wild opinions about every little thing you see is disease.
What do you think I'd consider it? Recreation?
I don't know what you consider it, but if you don't stop it, I'm getting out of here.
Well,
What is it you're looking for?
I just want to find out what's the matter with the salesman's wife, that's all. Does that make me sound like a madman?
What makes you think there's something the matter with
A lot of things. She's an invalid. She demands constant care. Yet neither the husband or anybody else been in to see her all day. Why?
Mulvey also coins the term phallocentrism to refer to the privileging of the masculine in the construction of meaning, promoting the phallus, the cis male, as the source of power, as the center of power. But what does that mean exactly, and how is it presented in the media and in the movies? Gender is an ideological system supported by myths regarding femininity and masculinity. Myths, sort of stories that get reproduced that don't have a basis in reality, let's say. So femininity, a trait or condition traditionally held to be associated with women; masculinity, traits or conditions traditionally held to be associated with men. Neither are part of that gendered condition, but are associated with. Likewise, and I quote from Terry Senf, I can have a body, but I cannot have a gender. Because gender is a result of performances among doctors, judges, communities, and families. That is, a doctor decides what gender you are at birth. A judge can also determine that your communities, how your parents call you, what your community refers to you as. It brings that forth, right? Oh, is it a boy or a girl when the baby is inside a womb? Even though maybe it's not a boy or a girl. And another example, does it truly matter how much real money you have in the bank, for example, if your ATM machine, an extension of the nation's computerized banking network, decides you don't have any? Now, you may not believe in gender, even after all that, but it believes in you. In some ways, gender was here before you. Unlike your body, gender is not a material thing, but it's a series of repeated acts of femininity or masculinity influenced by culture and ideology. Well, how do you know I'm a woman? I'm repeating certain kind of tasks associated generally with femininity, even though, of course, wearing makeup or earrings or having long hair doesn't really have to do with gender, does it? Because anybody can have those things. Now, today we know that gender, race, and identity are much more fluid concepts than Mulvey's 1970s arguments present. We know this through the tireless and often censored work of queer, Black, and post-colonial and decolonial scholars that provided more comprehension and nuance to Mulvey's initial arguments about the gaze and power. But what does it mean that gender is a fluid concept? For that, let's back up to our distinction of sex and gender to help. Now, what is sex? Sex is a name that we give to biological differences between males and females. In particular, sex refers to the presence or absence of certain kind of gonads, certain kind of genitalia, sex chromosomes and genes, and the composition of sex hormones. And even that is somewhat fluid. What is gender as opposed, or not opposed to, but distinct from sex? Gender is the name we give to the set of social relations that relate to our observations of sexual difference. In other words, sex concerns biology, whereas gender concerns society, culture, cinema and culture. So sex is material, gender is ideological. There's that word again, ideology. Now let's go back to the gaze. So far we've learned how the gaze is enacted through representation and is a product of ideology and is a form of power. As Foucault argues, the gaze that sees is the gaze that dominates. The gaze doesn't just apply to humans, though, but the way those in authority set up institutions and systems to dominate others, aka systems of surveillance. An instance of this is the panopticon, which we will discuss in class. It's considered a perfect prison designed to control prisoners by a mind over mind. And here you see a 1791 drawing. Now, in this panopticon is the ultimate surveillance, a sense of the omnipresence of the guard, right? It's in a circle, and that you assume you're always being watched, but you don't know if you're being watched. The panopticon operates under the idea of surveillance and self-censorship, in which it engenders conformity and adherence to the authority's agenda. Think of our role in society, how we act when we know we're being watched versus when we're not. And now you can consider the characters in Rear Window and what they do and how they do things. How are they seen? How are they not seen? How are they looking? How are they not looking? How are they able to look or not look? So finally, by the end of this lecture, you should be able to understand the gaze as a form of looking that dominates and examine the dominant ideologies to recognize who has access to the gaze by analyzing how it's reproduced in film. So if you can do that, great. And if not, maybe go back through the notes. And the next portion I'm including is that we'll go over and discuss together and in group workshops to untangle the terms on the following slide that I've connected with throughout this video, and how the terms that you'll just see help us critically engage with the movies. We'll also review mise-en-scène through an assessment activity. We will consider gender, the gaze, representation, ideology, femininity, masculinity, scopophilia, surveillance, and connection to today. So take care and enjoy the rest of the slideshow, and I'm so excited to see you in class.